Picture this. It's the early 1800s. Napoleon Bonaparte is the master of Europe. He's Grande Armée, a seemingly invincible force, has conquered nations and redrawn the map. From Austria to Prussia, kings and emperors bow before him. But then, he makes a fatal miscalculation. He turns his gaze to the Iberian Peninsula, to Spain and Portugal, expecting another swift victory. What he found instead was a nightmare that would haunt his empire for years, a conflict he himself would call his Spanish ulcer. This wasn't a war of grand battles between uniformed armies. This was a new kind of fight. A little war, or as the Spanish called it, guerrilla. This is the story of how ordinary Spanish people, priests, blacksmiths, and bandits rose up to defy the most powerful military machine on earth. So, how did it all begin? In 1807, Napoleon, ever the strategist, wanted to crush Great Britain, his last major rival. Since he couldn't invade them by sea, he decided to strangle them economically with something called the Continental System, basically a giant embargo. Portugal, a longtime British ally, refused to comply. So, Napoleon struck a deal with Spain, a seemingly weak government, to march his troops through Spain to conquer Portugal. But Napoleon had bigger plans. He saw a dysfunctional Spanish royal family, ripe for the picking. In 1808, using trickery and force, he deposed the Spanish king and placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne in Madrid. Napoleon thought the Spanish would just accept their new ruler. He couldn't have been more wrong. On the 2nd of May, 1808, 12 de Mayo, the people of Madrid erupted in a furious, spontaneous uprising against the French occupiers. It was a brutal, bloody street fight. Men and women with knives and farm tools against trained soldiers with muskets and cannons. The French, under Marshal Murat, crushed the rebellion with merciless efficiency. The next day, hundreds of captured Madrilegos were executed. The famous painter Goya captured these horrific events in his masterpieces. The 2nd of May 1808 and the 3rd of May 1808. The French thought this brutal display would terrorize the Spanish into submission. Instead, it lit a fire. News of the Madrid uprising and the subsequent massacres spread like wildfire across the country, and all of Spain rose in revolt. The Peninsular War had begun. This wasn't a conventional war. The Spanish regular army was scattered and defeated early on. But that's when something new emerged. All over the country, small, independent bands of fighters started to form. These were the guerrillas. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were locals who knew the terrain like the back of their hand. They knew every mountain pass, every hidden valley, every winding village street. They didn't wear uniforms. They blended in with the civilian population. One moment, they were a farmer tilling a field. The next, they were part of a deadly ambush. This made them nearly impossible for the French to identify and fight. What did guerrilla warfare actually look like? It was a war of 1,000 cuts, a constant, nagging, bleeding drain on French resources and morale. Guerrilla bands would attack French supply lines, ambushing convoys carrying food, ammunition, and mail. A small group of fighters could hide in the hills, wait for a vulnerable wagon train, strike quickly, and then vanish back into the countryside before the French could even organize a response. They would assassinate French officers, couriers, and officials. A French soldier who wandered too far from his barracks might never be seen again. They didn't seek out large, pitched battles they knew they would lose. Their strategy was evasion, surprise, and constant harassment. They turned the very landscape of Spain into a weapon. The French soldiers, used to fighting organized armies on open battlefields, were completely unprepared for this. They were in a constant state of anxiety. They couldn't trust anyone. The friendly villager who sold them bread by day might be the one slitting their sentries' throats by night. Communications were a nightmare. A message from a general in Madrid to a commander in Andalusia might have to be carried by a whole squadron of cavalry, and a Bentonet might not get through. It took hundreds of thousands of French troops just to guard the roads and try to keep supply lines open. Soldiers who could have been fighting on other fronts in Europe. The guerrillas tied down a massive portion of Napoleon's army in a frustrating and unwinnable conflict. Who were these guerrilla leaders? They were a fascinating mix of characters. Some were former army officers, like Francisco Espoz y Mina, a legendary leader in Navarre, who commanded thousands of fighters and created a mini-state within French-occupied territory, even collecting taxes and running his own administration. Others came from humbler backgrounds. You had figures like Juan Martin Diaz, nicknamed El Empecinado, or the Stubborn One, a farmer who became a brilliant cavalry leader after French soldiers attacked his family. There were even priests, like the famous Cura Moreno, who led their own bands of partisans, believing they were fighting a holy war against the godless French invaders. These leaders became folk heroes, their daring exploits told and retold in villages across Spain, inspiring more people to join the fight. The impact of this guerrilla war was immense. It wasn't just about the military casualties, though those were significant. It was the psychological toll. It demoralized the French army and gave hope to the Spanish people. It showed that Napoleon's forces were not invincible. The constant pressure from the guerrillas also created the perfect conditions for the conventional armies to succeed. While the guerrillas were bleeding the French dry, the British, under the Duke of Wellington, were able to use Portugal as a base to launch their own campaigns into Spain, supported by what was left of the Spanish regular army. The guerrillas provided crucial intelligence for Wellington, letting him know French troop movements and strengths, while constantly disrupting Napoleon's own plans. The French response to this ungentlemanly way of war was brutal. They engaged in what we would today call counterinsurgency, but with extreme ferocity. They burned villages suspected of harboring guerrillas, executed civilians in reprisal for attacks, and engaged in widespread torture to extract information. This, however, only created a vicious cycle of violence. The more brutal the French became, the more the Spanish people hated them, and the more support the guerrillas received. It fueled the resistance, turning a military conflict into a national crusade for survival and independence. Ultimately, the Peninsular War lasted 6 long years, from 1808 to 1814. It was a brutal, grinding conflict that cost hundreds of thousands of lives on all sides. For Napoleon, the Spanish ulcer was a disaster. It drained his empire of men, money, and prestige. The nearly 300,000 veteran troops bogged down in Spain were desperately needed in 1812 when he made his catastrophic invasion of Russia. The Spanish Guerrilla War was a pioneering example of modern national resistance. It demonstrated how a determined population, using unconventional tactics and their knowledge of the local terrain, could successfully challenge a vastly superior conventional army. It changed the face of warfare and left a lasting legacy, inspiring resistance movements all over the world for centuries to come. The story of the Spanish guerrillas is a powerful reminder that the will of the people can be the most formidable weapon of all. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story of defiance fascinating, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most epic conflicts. Let me know in the comments what you think. Could Napoleon ever have won in Spain? See you next time.